all scenarios. It's just, I think, scenario D, probably because it's so widespread and it's the land area it's covering, it has the biggest risk that things might not have the protections that they should have in place.
Sorry. So would you say A, B and C are the ones that should be consulted with mana whenua iwi, or are you saying, well, what are you saying, I guess, in terms of a comparison of scenarios, which is what's the preferred, because then you know what of one you don't agree with, what would be the preferred?
I think the preferred approach as staff is still to have a single scenario, but give iwi and local boards the full picture of how the committee has got to this point and seek feedback, not just on the single preferred scenario, but on any of the scenarios, really. So, yeah, I certainly don't think we should be engaging only on one scenario and not discussing any of the others. So they're at least there as an option for iwi local boards to say, actually, I like that scenario D or that scenario C, and that's my feedback.
You should be a diplomat. Thank you, John.
He'd probably rather be one sometimes, I'm sure. Councillor Gillen.
Thank you. My first couple of questions are along similar lines. I was actually really surprised when scenario B came through as your recommendation, because I'm sure that in the workshops it had been mentioned that it was much better for us to do the minimal changes now that the government's requiring, because we have the big changes coming up in the RMA, and we risk having to rework and pull things back in that. So are you able to comment on that, please?
Yeah, through the chair, we heard a range of views. We did hear that view from several members. We also heard support for intensifying, not just on train stations, but along bus corridors and maximising the opportunities to travel by not just train, but also bus, other modes than the private motor vehicle. So we heard a range of views. I guess the key thing is that, well, one of the key things is that percentage difference is 2% of the geographic area of urban Auckland between A and B. So by bringing in the bus corridors and some of the smaller local centres is only a 2% difference. I'm not saying it's not a big difference in those locations, but in terms of your question, Councillor Gillen, around RM reform, and Council Auckland may have to go through something similar, maybe going through something similar in the next 2 to 3 years. Both A and B are very much concentrating the change as opposed to C and D, which is much more widespread. So there is a slight difference between A and B in terms of geographic area, 2%, but once you jump up to C and D, you're up to 100% of the geographic area.
Okay, I'm certain it was a staff member that has said it, not a councillor. But anyway, I'll move on to the next question. It says that scenario B provides more of a buffer for the hearing panel than scenario A. So I assume that's actually why you're going with scenario B. However, in attachment A, table figure 2, which goes into detail about scenario A, it talks about how in order to meet the minimum capacity that we need to, it's not mandatory for the council to achieve all the capacity through Plan Change 120. We can also use the capacity from Plan Change 78 metropolitan centres, it's already been approved, and the private plan changes that have happened since then. So there is reasonable certainty that the minimum housing capacity requirement for the AUP will be met. So I take that scenario A does have sufficient buffer for the hearing panel to utilise.
Well, as you can see on the slide there, we're estimating 1.4 to 1.6 million. The latest information from our modelling team is that there is a buffer above the 1.4. It's certainly not spot on the 1.4. They haven't run the scenarios fully through the model. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks to run each of the scenarios. But we've got the latest estimates in spreadsheet form, which is 1.5. Roughly 1.5 million is with the latest changes. Because we're sort of building this as we fly, use that metaphor, you know, the hazard information has just been changing in the last week or two, and the GIS maps, some refinements to you know, particular locations. We're not quite there, but it looks like it looks like there is a buffer with A.
Sorry, so A is now...
A does have a
more-
buffer.
it's close to
We said the
1.5.
range is 1.4 to 1.6. It looks as though it's landing at about 1.5.
Okay.
And certainly for your final decisions or your decisions in July, we will have a precise modelled figure.
Okay, thank you. And I want to just clarify something about Takapuna, which I think you've already covered, but I just want to be 100% clear. So Takapuna is classed as a metro centre and has the Takapuna 1 precinct. The walkable catchments under scenario A will be 6 stories, even though it's a metro centre and not a town centre, whereas under scenario B, because we have the 10-kilometre circle coming into effect, then the existing, or the 10 to 15 metre 10 to 15 story will apply to the walkable catchment.
That's correct. That's the difference between A and B for the Takapuna Metro Centre. Yep.
Okay, thank you. And paragraph 29 of the report, you actually recommend only putting forward one scenario because doing more than one scenario would, let me read here, it says, staff do not have the time, budget or resources to provide detailed sets of maps and analysis of all 4 or any other combination of scenarios and still meet the legislative timeframes. Are you now saying today that you actually can support more than one scenario because the chair's put forward 2 scenarios?
Through the chair, because of this similarity between A and B, we now believe that by the first local board meeting next week, we would have A and B in the similar level of detail in that GIS viewer that Phil presented before, to build all of the changes, the zoning changes in C into a similar viewer would take us another 2 to 3 weeks, but we would certainly have A and B ready for next week in an equivalent level of detail for local boards.
I checked with staff yesterday because I said, what if we put forward A, B, C, because there were people at the workshop saying C, but they're very clear. If C was chosen, yes, they could do the maps for C, but A and B were the only ones that could provide 2 options because they're so similar. So we won't be precluding local boards and iwi authorities to comment on C and D, but to have that's why I've got F, which says note detailed maps and online map viewer for scenarios A and B will be available. So it means that people can do a very detailed view of A and B, but can only really comment on the high levels for C and D. Yeah. Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Before I get into the options here, I just need some context. So I've got some questions that I hope are okay, just so that I'm clear in my own mind. And while there have been workshops, today is about governance and it's about the assumptions that we're here to make decisions as regional councillors. We're not about addressing perceived anomalies or disparities. That's the role for the local boards to deal with those local issues. Am I correct in my assumption on that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary, Councillor Fletcher. Yep.
So again, coming back to these assumptions, so the issues of affordability, proximity to employment, and all of these sorts of things are going to be common to the fore. And for people who are only just getting their heads around this, it's hard to believe because we've had a lot of rain and much water under the bridge since Phil Twyford and David Parker started this process back in 2020. And it's sort of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development morphed into PC 78, which in turn has morphed into PC 120. So it seems now quite a lot to keep recalibrating and reconsidering all of these issues. So that was 6 long years ago. The real estate boom is well and truly over. We have a new government, we have a new mayor, we have new councillors elected. So things have changed, but some things I'm being given to understand sort of haven't changed. So I wonder whether you can just touch on some of the issues that are going to be common to all of them, around qualifying matters, including infrastructure, wastewater, limiting intensification, and so forth, because we haven't really dealt with any of those things thus far today.
So through the chair, on the infrastructure question, I think it's important to keep in mind that this plan-enabled capacity of 1.4 million, 2 million, is never going to be achieved. You know, it's a planning envelope, but it's the demand for housing, the market response, changes to population and so on that actually drive population increases and so on, and where the demand for infrastructure is. So there are parts of the region already, as we know, that Watercare is struggling to service any existing development. They are planning to invest in those areas to create more capacity. They are following this plan change very carefully. Even under the existing energy plan without any changes, there will be some areas where the infrastructure is lagging behind. That's not new. That is something that does happen. But
I don't want you to labour that too much on that specific issue, because we have heard regularly about this is zoning, this isn't about actual houses. But I'm interested in qualifying matters. You know, we've got others, volcanic view shafts. If we go back to the AUP, we had issues like special character. And a question that I'd really like to put to you is, has there been the chance to have a look at these refined scenarios on whether there is the opportunity for the retention of any quality, special character, continuing on as qualifying matters despite being in walkable catchment areas?
So, through the chair, under Plan Change 120, there is a proposed reduction in the special character areas. I think it's by roughly 25% of the properties would no longer have that special character protection, but there's still the protection in place for the remaining roughly 75%. When we brought this matter to the committee a few months ago, there was a decision made to not make any changes to the qualifying matters, which includes special character. So we are just guided by you as a committee. You've made that decision to retain the qualifying matters exactly as they are in Plan Change 120, and so we're not proposing anything different to what's already in 120. So the protection of the Maunga view shafts is as per 120. The approach to special character with the 25% or so reduction is as per 120, and you as a committee have given staff guidance that that's the direction to head in.
I'm pleased to learn that, and I'm just trying to understand whether you intend to do further work in terms of all of these scenarios in going forward. And I don't want to monopolise all the time here today, but I have a few other questions that are just general to the fore. Notwithstanding para 10 in the report, is there a risk that you as officers have discussed about not undertaking public consultation earlier? We're going local boards, mana whenua, but we did put our submitters through quite a lot of pressure and in some cases cost to meet that 19th of December deadline. And I wonder whether there is a possibility that there could be a perception that we're being disrespectful to our submitters. My question is, had the officers given consideration to that?
Well, we have looked at the legal situation, and there is no requirement legally that...
It says that in para 10, I know, but was there a moral obligation, or was there any discussion around that matter?
Not in terms of.
I'm happy to
the moral
answer,
situation,
John.
no.
Look, through the chair, we are trying to balance again, continuing, as you say, this process started in 2020, so we're trying to balance time and kind of getting through this, in inverted commas, with still being open and transparent, particularly to ensure local boards and iwi have some ability to help inform and give you opportunities to hear what they think. And then there will be a public notification process, public submission process. But we don't think we are able to balance the time and speed and everything else with having a few months, because it would take at least 3 or 4 months to go through a kind of draft public consultation process. We do want to enable that once any decision you make to notify something. And we will go through that for a public notification process.
So was there any discussion amongst officers that that government should be, or have that drawn to their attention, that we might have needed more time to do justice to this, particularly in light of the fact, and I know you referred to it with Member Wilson and also with Councillor Gillen, but we know, I mean, currently we are required to go through a review of the Auckland Unitary Plan, but that might then be gobbled up by or morphed into something else. But we do know that there is legislation pending, so that we will have this process to go through potentially all over again. So was there any dialogue at all on this between officers and central government?
Through the chair, we said, well, when this was, again, the kind of legislation was proposed and things, or the changes proposed, the final date of about June 2027 didn't seem to be up for grabs from the central government's position to change. So we did say that if this occurs and we have another minimum housing capacity target, and we have to go through all of this process, plus notification, plus hearings and submissions, that it will be very difficult for us to meet that time frame. But that time frame was not changed from the government. So that was the nature of the conversation. We obviously didn't get anywhere on that.
Okay, no, well, it's just interesting because we get all sorts of information given to us, and I had a wad of papers that I hadn't seen before that were cabinet papers and correspondence from the Mayor's office and so forth, and maybe they'd been given to me and I just hadn't kept on top of my correspondence. I'm really not sure. But it does strike me as, given how, we've had these 6 years, that we might have pushed a little bit harder to say, hey, let's do it once and let's do it properly. But you're saying, no, that there wasn't an appetite by the government for that. Okay, so what has the process cost us since 2020? And if we continue with PC 120, before we even start on the fresh process, what are the estimated costs of this?
I'm just checking to see whether we've got that or whether we might need to come back to you on that. We don't want to guess, inappropriately on that.
I think we just need to go back and check the numbers. Yep.
I imagine the first process was 10 million. By December, we'd spent 3 million on 120. So I imagine all up it'll end up 20. I mean, if you're thinking about a similar process doubled,
Tens of millions, yeah.
could be $20 million.
About 13 million up to that point. Yeah.
About 30 million.
13.
Okay.
But I think we should just.
13. Sorry? Say that
Sorry,
again?
it was 10. Plan change 78 that didn't get completed was $10 million. By Christmas, the actual dotted line advice was 3 so far for plan change 120. So that's 13 all up. But I'm assuming by the end of, if you just replicate 2 plans, one was 10, the next one should probably be 10. So you're talking $20 million by middle of next year.
Utopia's expensive. So can you then help me, because I want to come back to these refined scenarios and put it in the context of the fact that we're probably going to have to revisit it all again anyway, which is, from my perspective, really frustrating. Can you talk about whether scenario A will be easier or less timely, less costly, less less admin? Or, you know, which of these is going to be, in terms of processing, the easier one? And also on that, I mean, if I come back to scenario A, it seems to have the ability to meet government's objectives with flexibility, but without overreach. Can you just give me a bit of feedback on that?
So through the chair, scenario A is the one with least change to the unitary plan, and therefore, if the council is going through another process similar to this in the next 2 or 3 years, then scenario A would be the one that would result in the least change. But there isn't a huge amount of difference between A and B. I'll stress that again. 2% of the urban area difference. So yes, 2% spatially of the urban area would be in B and not in A. So 2% of all properties in mostly residential Auckland would be captured by B, but not A. Once you move to C and D, very different. It's the entire region and potentially a lot of rework. So, but A is the one absolutely that has the least change and at the least risk of having to redo things. This does link into a decision you will also be asked to make in July around to withdraw areas of no change or to keep them still in play for the hearings panel and submitters. So there is quite a strong link to that decision as well. And we do intend to hopefully get a workshop with you before the July decision making, just to talk through the differences between withdrawing in part areas of no change or still keeping them in. But again, scenario A is the one with least change, so I guess scenario A would be the one with least risk of some form of reconsideration of the same matters in the next 2 or 3 years.
Chair, I'll let others have a turn, but could I just make a request now that if we are to have further workshops, these are big and meaty issues and they are really complex. Could we ensure that the workshops that we have are perhaps longer in duration so that everyone can really do a deep dive into the areas of interest that they might have? I would really appreciate that. But I'll let others take a call now.
Thank you. And just on the 2%, John, are you saying that under scenario B, 85% of Auckland's urban area does not change from the unitary plan, and under A, 87%? Like that's just...
That's correct.
Okay. Councillor Henderson.
Thank you. I've got a number of questions. I'll start with yourself, Gary. I've got a couple for you. So I understand that each scenario has preliminary economic analysis, and there's been some reporting on this. But could you take this committee through what economic benefit each option is expected to have, A through D?
Through the chair, thank you, Councillor Henderson. The economic benefit that we've estimated relates to not only the quantity of new homes that we forecast, but the spatial pattern. And so we're really interested in the parts of Auckland that might become more dense over time. If those locations are high demand, well connected, we would expect supply to be stronger in those locations if capacity is added. And so when we get more density in those those accessible locations, it supports a number of things in terms of our economy. It supports people accessing jobs, it supports a better match between jobs and workers, and supports more sharing of infrastructure. And so there's a strong relationship over time and across cities, globally and nationally, where you get more density in central locations that's positively associated with higher GDP and higher incomes. And so the way we've estimated it is to take those density estimates 10 years out and to look at New Zealand-specific research that looks at the relationship between density and productivity. And when we apply those parameters, we get some values which we express as, I guess, additional GDP. 10 years from now, we express it in today's money. And so they range from around, I think, $0.1 billion for scenario A to about, I think, $0.4 billion. Have I got that right? I'll just read it out here.
I can test the figures because I've got them in front of me.
Well, I think the figures have changed since the workshop, is what I would say. The numbers I'm, for simplicity, reporting today relate to annual figures in year 10 and in today's money. And so those amounts, I'll read them out to you just for clarity. So as a year 10 figure in today's money, we've got $0.1 billion under scenario A, ranging to 0.4 under scenario B, 0.5 under C, and 0.6 under scenario D. So really we're looking at somewhere between 0.1 and 0.5% of GDP as another way to think about it. A little bit different from some earlier numbers that you may have seen in the workshop, which I think the way I did it then, very much preliminary estimates and based on an earlier version of some of the scenarios, so a little bit out of date. But the reason why those numbers may look larger is that they're presented as an aggregate over 10 years, but the ones I've got today are at year 10, an ongoing annual amount.
Okay, so I think I'm getting you. Because there's such a wide variance between these figures. Can I just put the figures to you, and can you tell me whether they're accurate? So, scenario A, 700 million return. This is potential economic benefits. These things. So, scenario A, 700 million. Scenario B, 1.7 billion. Scenario C, 3.3 billion, and scenario D, 3.9 billion. So those are huge differences, and they're also huge differences to what we've heard today. So can you comment on that? Because that is really confusing to me. Yeah.
Through the chair, I understand, yes, those figures that you've mentioned are the 10-year cumulative figures, so that's one reason for the difference, and they combine the annual productivity gains in GDP terms together with another concept, which is the lower house prices in future, to the extent that's freeing up, I guess, household income. So we've counted that as well in those figures you've got over 10 years. And I would say about the numbers that you've mentioned, the scenario B was a slightly earlier version which didn't have the FTNs included that John mentioned. So the number that you've mentioned is probably a little bit lower if we were to run it again. And C is probably a little bit on the optimistic side, I think, relative to what we know now.
Right, but it's fair to say that over that cumulative period, the figures that I've quoted are, with those qualifications, relatively accurate.
Broadly, but that preliminary analysis will be something that we'll revisit through this process and come back with some firm figures. Thank you.
Thanks. I really appreciate that advice because it's very important that we as decision makers sum up the effect of our decisions on Auckland's GDP and economic activity, and now we know. So that's good. Thank you. So just a couple questions from my colleagues I'll just pick up and sort of follow a bit further. Councillor Patterson-Hamlin's question, is it fair to say broadly house prices will be lower in the future under scenario D than the other scenarios?
Through the chair, Councillor Henderson, I think it's fair to say that we're confident about the general direction and the rough scale that we're talking about, rather than precision over the numbers. So yes, in response to an increase in housing supply and the stock of housing being greater under D, I think you mentioned relative to the other scenarios, that is the case, that we would expect the affordability gains to be stronger.
Thanks, I really appreciate that too. So I'm not sure whether this is Gary or the rest of you guys, but I've got a question on climate emissions because the climate emission statement in the report was rather light, and I need to explore that a little more. So scenario B and scenario A I'm comparing now. Which is better for expected climate emissions?
Through the chair, we haven't undertaken any detailed modelling of emissions, climate impacts. It will be an incredibly complicated exercise with some very, very broad assumptions around likely take-up of particularly the 6, 10 and 15-storey areas. There's a lot of uncertainty as to how many apartment buildings we're actually going to see over the next 5, 10 years in these areas that might be earmarked for 6, 10, 15 stories. So a lot depends on will the market respond in a very different way to the way that it has historically to that opportunity for apartments. What will that mean in terms of mode shift, and therefore what might that mean in terms of emissions? But stepping right back and looking at it, there are some opportunities for more intensification along bus routes and more height along some of the train stations in B relative to A, and therefore B would have the edge in terms of climate over A.
Okay, so B has it over A, thank you. I've got two more cues. So I'm just thinking about Councillor Bartley's questioning around upzoning stations and bus corridors. Under B, wouldn't it actually take pressure off Maungakeke Tamaki as an example? Because there's more housing opportunities closer to the city. So rather than putting more pressure on the ward, wouldn't it take pressure off the ward? Isn't that fair?
I'd have to look at the bus corridors again. I think there may be some through the Maungakeke Tamaki area, but I suppose, yeah, those extra opportunities that you get for B around some of the bus routes not in Maungakeke Tamaki may mean that there is some development happening in those areas as opposed to Maungakeke Tamaki. So yeah, there may be a slight difference in terms of A and B, with B perhaps spreading the intensification more widely across the isthmus. I think that's a reasonable call.
Thank you, appreciate that. And finally, looking under attachment C, where it's available, our vote on the principles back in the days. So could I firstly ask you, just as a general statement, how have you applied the principles that we voted through to this analysis and this advice today?
They were the starting point, and they're present in all of the scenarios to differing degrees. Quite a few of the principles actually use the phrase as a starting point. In fact, some of the fundamental ones talked about as a starting point. So, remove intensification along bus corridors outside of 10K circle as a starting point. Reduce intensification outside of 10 kilometres as a starting point, but it certainly didn't say that was the end point. So it is present in all scenarios. It was faithfully applied to all scenarios. It is potentially, some of those principles are stronger in some scenarios than others, but they're definitely present in all scenarios.
So I would contend that being a part of that vote, it was the will of this committee to look at a scenario where it is PC 120 inside the 10 kilometre radius and essentially unitary plan outside. We don't have a scenario here today that gives us that, so I'm asking you why not?
I believe you have scenarios that reflect those principles that you set, and in the workshops we didn't hear a particularly strong view that we needed to really take a different direction and come up with a scenario that was very strongly rooted and not using the 10 kilometres as a starting point, but actually used it as an end point. So there was no feedback in the workshops that we're heading in the wrong direction. As I say, all of those scenarios reflect the principles to differing degrees. I think that's all I can say, really.
I could probably further that line, but I think it might be the realm of the political, so I'll come back to that in debate. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. We were almost there, but I'm going to close it after Mayor Brown and Member Blair, so we can get to the debate. Mayor Brown.
Okay. I didn't want to, but I've got three questions. If we choose A, will that make it more difficult to sort of face off greenfield developments? There's a section of the government want us to do greenfield development. So if we go for the minimum, doesn't that make it more likely that they will justify and be more pressure on greenfield?
I can go there. Through the chair, thank you, Your Worship. I think you're really getting at an important point here, is that if we enable more capacity in higher demand locations in the urban area, we would expect more of our future growth to be accommodated in the existing urban area. And so the impulse or the pressure to grow at the fringe will be lower than otherwise. I think that will be a reasonable conclusion, that the more we enable Auckland's population growth and the latent demand among existing residents to be met within the existing urban area, it puts less pressure further out. So you must get like an inward ripple effect and lower demand at the fringe.
Yeah, well, that's what I thought too. It's just supply and demand. And then, again, if we crimp supply with A, that's probably likely to meet more pressure for resource consents in those undisturbed areas for something taller than what they expect. Is that right?
Well, I think that's a reasonable hypothesis, that if you have a level of right that's set lower, you might get more of that demand seeking to push for the discretionary element through resource consents, compared with if you had a threshold as of right set higher, you might have less pressure on resource consenting than otherwise, but you need to empirically test it, I think, to be
Okay,
sure.
so you're confirming it could do the opposite of what it expects. You go for the lower one, is more likely to end up with more pressure exactly where the people don't want much happening anyhow. So that's an odd thing. And then how do we justify and explain that we're going to, that it makes sense to intensify and build high buildings around railway stations going west and not going east? Because I would have thought Newmarket, which is already surrounded by multi-storey buildings, and Ellerslie were ideal places to do that. But it would look a bit, it looks completely irrational if we do this. B at least looks moderately rational, and I don't like doing things which are embarrassingly irrational.
So through the chair, that is one of the key reasons that we, as officers, are recommending at this point scenario B, because it treats the stations evenly, east, west, central, south, whereas scenario A is very heavily focused on the western line.
Well, that makes no sense to me. We're not going to charge different fares out east, are we, or anything like that? No, so, and then under the area that was shown as white, no change or anything, that's all potentially up to 6 stories anyhow. Are people still allowed to go into one of those and put in a resource consent to put up a 10-storey building if they can justify it?
Through the chair, that's correct. The zoning in those white areas would mostly be for 2 or 3 stories. There will be some places where it can go beyond that. But the way the rules in the unitary plan work, there's nothing to prevent someone applying, say, on a large site with plenty of space around it for something a bit taller. And
Just next door to where Mr Seymour lives, for instance, it'd be a really good one. I'm thinking of a 10-storey there, would be good.
and then assessed on its merits through the resource consent.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that. It does show. So, and why wouldn't we put out all of them to the public anyhow? We come down to the pinch nostril version is the A, the sort of just about being prepared to do something and think about it as A and B. But are we saying that the public and the local boards aren't capable of understanding what C and D might be? Are we that clever ourselves, are we?
I think just we said before, Mayor, that there's a lot of work that goes into the maps and the viewers. If we chose just C, the team would be able to have enough time to get the proposal and all the things done for C, but they've said that they can do that for A and B because they're so similar, but trying to do 3 different map viewers and all those maps in the short time between now and the local boards. But it doesn't preclude, so scenario C and D with the big map, they'll still be able to comment on it. They just won't have the grained, I don't know, detailed information, but they have said A and B are possible to both send out in that form to local boards and
Oh,
Manawatu.
okay, well, that's a reasonable response, although I think that rush things for something that's going to take 30 years has always struck me as a bit foolhardy, but then again, who am I? All right, thanks for those answers.
Thanks for those questions. Member Blair.
Kia ora, John. And tēnā koutou, acknowledge your team and all the hard work in what is a very highly politically charged issue as well. I just wanted a bit of clarity on which of the options would concentrate more of the floor area and development opportunity on the isthmus, the central isthmus, and the major transport nodes. Which is the best option that does that?
Tanaka, Member Blair. B and C, there's a complexity there, so it's not that straightforward. So,
But shouldn't it
yes,
be?
yeah.
I mean, that's where the
The
services are on the isthmus,
Yep.
and then the major transport nodes is where you should uplift the development east west.
So B certainly more than A. So B is ahead of A because of the extra height on the train stations in the isthmus and the bus corridors in the isthmus. So B definitely more so than A. C spreads things evenly across the region, so not so much concentration on the isthmus. And then D, if you stick with Plan Change 120 as it is, it has those heights around the train stations and the isthmus and the bus corridors, but also outside. So I'm thinking it through myself. I think the answer is B. Of all the scenarios, B is the one that probably leans most towards the isthmus.
I could add something.
Gary? Yeah.
Through the chair, kia ora, member Blair. Thinking about it from a housing supply perspective, we have done some forecasting over 10 years of the take-up of these opportunities that John's talked about. And if we think about the 10 kilometre circle that's been referenced earlier today, sort of preliminary work suggests that of our 10-year supply, perhaps under the operative plan, we might see somewhere between sort of 10 to 15% of our growth being accommodated within 10 kilometres. Under scenario A, that would be up around 15 to 19, I think. And then under scenario B, getting up to sort of 24. And then I think C and D around 28, 29. So just with the extra enablement and those higher demand locations, especially those frequent transit networks, we expect to see through the scenarios a bit more within the 10 kilometres, if you think of that as a proxy for the isthmus, roughly. I hope that helps.
Thank you. I will call this the last, so we're going back to, Councillor Foley hasn't actually asked a question, but Councillor Foley.
Kia ora. Thanks, Chair, and thanks, team, for all of your hard work that you've put into this as well. I've read very carefully the report and the presentations and listened to what's been said as well, and I've made notes and tried to compare the differences between A and B for my Manukau ward. So I just want to fact check with you to make sure that I've got things right. So under option A for the Manukau ward, the Papatoetoe station, the walkable catchments around Papatoetoe, Puinui, Manukau Metro Centre, Manukau Otahu train station under option A, those would all come down to 6 stories, and also under option B. Is that correct? They come down to 6 stories.
That's correct. Under both scenarios, they would both come down to 6 stories.
Okay. The town centres, there'd be no change under both A and B. The big change comes in the local centres, what's proposed for the local centres. So under option A, all of those proposed changes would be removed, but under option B, for example, around the local centres like Dawson Road, Mangere East, that would go up to 6 stories. Is that correct?
Just trying to get I had the two side by side before. If we just look at that again, and I do have the full list of the local centres. That's seeing them side by side. So A on the left, B, you can see some of those small centres coming through with the sort of orange and pink colours. And they would have the 6 stories around those local centres up to roughly 200 metres under scenario B, whereas in the scenario A, those smaller local centres would not have that 6-storey enablement. Yep.
Right, thank you. And then in terms of the frequent transport network corridors, under A, the proposed changes would be removed, but under B, the proposed changes would be removed for corridors outside of the 10K distance from the city centre. So that would also mean that for my area, for Botany to Manukau via Ormiston, and also Papatoetoe Otahu Sylvia Park would also be removed. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that's correct.
Kia ora. So the main change for my ward is really the local centres.
That's correct. Yeah, that's the main difference between the two for your ward, because you're outside that 10 kilometres. For the wards inside the 10 kilometres, you've also got the bus routes still retained, and so the bigger difference there. Yep.
Kia ora. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Kia ora. And I spoke to the Chairs Forum yesterday and made it clear that that would be the type of feedback that they could give, that they wanted those bus routes back, or they wanted local centres not being in either. It's not about if say more than one proposal went forward, or they might want to comment on C and D as well. It's not locking in any map going forward. Right, we will get you to move back from the table. I think that we're pretty exhausted your time there. So how we will do this, everyone, I'll just speak briefly to the item I put up. Then if Councillor Newman still would, he still wants to do his amendment, I think I will use Councillor Newman as the first speaker to move his amendment. We will then debate the amendment. If that wins, it becomes a substantive. If that gets voted down, we move back to the substantive, which is the A and the B. Cool. Okay. Thank you very much. So just briefly, I had heard the feedback from many people through the workshops, and I do understand why the staff put through the B as the scenario. That did seem to be the kind of the middle ground between all the feedback that was coming. There was people saying C, people saying A, and then people wanting different parts of B and C across. I know that certain members, I think Councillor Fletcher, brought up the concerns around the fact the government only mentioned one line. Why was that in legislation, just the Western? So I think incorporating the other lines to try and match up was taken on by staff. The bus routes have been something that I think everyone around here, last time we were at this table, was saying frequent bus corridors made sense. We're investing a lot of money in those. So I think that's why the officers have put that in there too. The reason I had after the amendment came through, and I thank Councillor Newman for putting that quite ahead of time, and we've had conversations on the phone as well, there were some concerns from others that it really did lock it down. So what I tried to do is to avoid some of the debates we've had recently, to try and just bring it together. Granted that a couple of councillors are grumpy I did not put forward C, but the staff had said if C was chosen on its own, yes, there's time, but A and B, because they're quite close together, would be easy to provide the detailed information for local boards. And I think that's the key for me here, that this is about getting local board feedback, iwi authority feedback on at least two options. These two options, A and B, could go forward. Doesn't preclude them talking on the C and D, but they won't have that street by street, property by property detail like the A and B. I think the other thing is to remember where we've come from. You know, Plan Change 120 and 78 touched almost every street in our whole city. These two items, these two plans, it's 87% or 85% of Auckland's urban area that will stay as the unitary plan. Some people won't like that. Some people will obviously think their property should have been upzoned. We might start getting questions from that. People might be shocked that the last 4 years they've had the ability to build to 3 stories, and now they may be back to single house through both of these scenarios. So both of these scenarios really focused on where the infrastructure is, where the transport is, and it does leave most of those parts of Auckland unchanged. We will hear from the public after we hear from the local boards on whatever choice we choose, but I really want local boards to be focusing and iwi authorities to be focusing on any changes they want, things they agree with, things they don't, how you build the final plan that goes to consultation, and then the public will have their say once again, which they're probably exhausted by. So I'll leave it there. I will now go to the amendment, and then I'll ask Councillor Newman if he'd like to speak to his amendment. And so Councillor Winiata is seconding that amendment. We can see it on our screen.
Look, thank you, Chair. And look, firstly, the reason why the amendment is presented is that the amendment is presented to the officer's recommendation. I acknowledge the discussions that we've had subsequent. I prefer scenario A, and I prefer it that we actually land on a position today if possible. And scenario A does achieve certain things. It exceeds the government's density target. It does provide more housing capacity than what the operative Auckland Unitary Plan provides. It does provide for the rezoning, which is updated to reflect the flood modelling and rainfall data. It does meet the Policy 3D NPSUD targets around walkable catchments. It does allow for the heights in relation to the walkable catchments for the 5 stations as codified in the legislation. and it will be possible under scenario A to accommodate the potential change in the height to boundary rule for the residential mixed housing urban zone, which is set out in attachment I in the report. So scenario A does actually achieve a lot. You could say, well, it's bare bones, but actually in the context of permissive Auckland, where a lot of Aucklanders are rather tired by the change that has been taking place, it still moves to accommodate what we are required to do. Now, I think that the officers have set out in a pretty comprehensive report. A lot of the information that has been addressed in officers' answers was actually set out in this report. Scenario A reflects all the things that it can be achieved at paragraph 26. At paragraph 27, the officers who clearly prefer scenario B have set out the reasons why. I just happen to disagree with a number of the features of scenario B, and Councillor Foley alluded to that. She interrogated the issue in relation to the town centres outside of the 10-kilometre radius, which affect outer suburban communities such as hers and mine. If the amendment fails and the Chair's recommendations pass, Chair, you will expect that there will be local boards in outer suburban Auckland who will be coming back with precisely that concern. And I happen to agree with them. That's one of the primary reasons why I don't agree with scenario B. Chair, I think it's worth noting that as Councillor Fletcher has said, we have been at this now for 6 bloody long years. And this was first mooted by Minister Parker and Minister Twyford when we had the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, and then we had to notify Plan Change 78, and then we had a flood, and then we had updated flood modelling and rainfall data which said that actually we're going to need to make adjustments. Then we had an election, then we had an MP from Lower Hutt say that Auckland needed to dial up for 2 million, and then the government found that that wasn't popular, so some of us have been involved in some pretty intensive lobbying over a year now to dial that number down, and it went from 2 million to 1.6 to 1.4. I commend the officers for maintaining their decorum and their sense of humour throughout these past 6 years, because it has been a ridiculous lazy Susan of planning rules set down by central government for which we're having to respond to in real time. But we have to land on something, because I think that Aucklanders are getting tired, and I am tired. So, Chair, I believe that, and just one other thing, I accept that for those councillors who believe that we have to level up Auckland by ensuring that the full impact of urbanisation is felt across every postcode, totally get their aspiration to do that. The reason why that hasn't happened is because some communities won the argument around special character area when we did the proposed Auckland Unitary Plan, which predates me, but that's what happened. And the only way to rectify that, if you're really askance at that, is to vote for scenario D. Short of that, some communities are going to be the so-called winners because they'll be less touched than others. But that's the reason why there is a disparity in urbanisation. I happen to think that the whole notion that we are here to try and engineer a more affordable housing market, that's not the issue here, because it's, yes, there's going to be a degree more affordability if you increase housing supply, but I actually think that the first thing is to think about whether we have the capacity to accommodate it, whether our infrastructure can cope with that, whether the rules actually allow for the sort of urbanisation that is going to ensure that our wastewater network can cope, that our drains can cope, that we've got the capacity within our, community facilities network, whether they can cope with the sort of urbanisation. Clearly, we are under pressure. The other thing that we're under pressure with is our community, because I believe that the planning of Auckland is now such that Aucklanders are utterly exhausted by what they have seen. And this is exhausting. And yes, we can have more submissions, but people are just saying, quite frankly, there's been so much that has happened. Most Aucklanders couldn't tell you what the latest scenario is that they're supposed to be submitting on. They're just exhausted. Who isn't? Anyway, Chair, in saying that, I do want to acknowledge that I think that you have done, both yourself and Megan and some of the officers in the Mayor's office have worked pretty jolly hard over the past few days to try and work out what we can do moving forward. So I would like my amendment to pass. I'd like people to support the move for a strike out B and go with scenario A, essentials only. As I said, if that doesn't pass, I think that you will get further conversations, and you can expect that the town centres in the outer suburbs of Auckland will be the primary. It won't be the only issue, but it'll be the primary concern for which we will need to have some further discussion and further compromise. Because quite frankly, I do think if you're going to look at change, the change really needs to be focused in that 10-kilometre radius. However, Chair, I think we could probably land this right now if we adopted the amendment as moved by me, and I look forward to receiving your support. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you very much. Councillor Patterson-Hamlin.
Kia ora, yeah. For the NCEA generation, A isn't the top mark, it's the sort of lowest pass mark, and it stands for achieved. And I think that's probably quite a good description of this one. The good news is, as Councillor Newman was saying, no matter which 4 of the options we go with, the majority of the submitters have been responded to in the sense that PC 120 is amended, natural hazards better planned for, the CRL investment better recognised, and they all allow for more housing, as you say, but there's so much overlap in those numbers that I think that the main question isn't really how much new housing, because it's an enablement anyway, but it's where and how. To deliberately shy away from a more equitable and better served economically city, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, which is why I'm not going to support this amendment. And the 5% improvement, so broadly B, C and D will provide around 5% with it. 5% is in the ballpark of the housing affordability compared to A, which is 1 to 2%. And 5% might not sound like a lot, but for the average rated home with the average mortgage in this city, that's 2/3 of the total rates bill. Like it's a big difference to people's lives. So yes. So, and in terms of median house price and that as well, the affordability question, Auckland's one of the least affordable cities in the world. We know this. We spent the morning talking about homelessness. We're very aware of this. Ratio of 3 on the house price to income ratio is considered to be affordable. A ratio of 9 is considered to be impossibly unaffordable, and we are sitting at 8.2. So to do less deliberately, to not give local boards and iwi the options of looking at potentially doing more, at least, it doesn't sit well with me. And I think A is a wasted opportunity. And if we do go with A, I think we need to have some really serious conversations, because A, as I've said earlier today, it actively decides to push more of that development impetus onto the south and west, and where we have fewer pools, less green space, fewer amenities, longer distances to employment, less FTNs. I think there's got to be some serious questions about where we're putting our investment as a city if we're going to deliberately make that choice. And I've read through maybe 500 or 600 of the submissions, not all 10,000 yet, sorry, but probably a statistically significant sample. And whether they approved PC 120 or declined it, or as the vast majority did, approved it with amendments. And I was actually surprised to see there's a few of those amendments were please upzone my area. The thing that kept coming through, the consistent thing that kept coming through, was we understand Auckland needs more housing, but we want the intensification to happen where it makes sense and where the infrastructure is. In my view, the further towards D we get, the more that is true, and A is a wasted opportunity. So I won't be supporting this amendment. But thanks everyone for all your mahi. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you. Councillor Watson.
Mr. Chair, I only speak once in this, so I'll have my piece now. Boy, what about that old saying, more haste, less speed, is it? And someone just referred to the tortuous experience submitters and Aucklanders generally have been put through over the last 6 years. We've gone from plan changes that were notified, that were partially withdrawn, that were enabling 2 million dwellings, then they were getting reduced a couple of months later from 2 million to 1.6, from kind of 1.6 then a couple of months later to 1.4. Hardly the most coherent planning preparation you'd have to say. And unfortunately, you know, our people, our residents have got caught up in that. But the one thing that process, that tortuous process has done is made it quite clear, if we look at the course submission feedback, of what Aucklanders want, and way more than double wanted the plan change declined or amended, as opposed to accepted without changes, with or without changes. In fact, 56% as opposed to 23%. So Aucklanders have already told us in that course data which way they are leaning, and it's pretty clear it's to the lower option rather than anything that's higher. And while all this notification and withdrawal and increase and decrease have been going on, what's actually been happening on the ground? Well, latest census data shows that more people in Auckland now are growing up in joined dwellings, such as apartments, flats and units and townhouses. Numbers rose by 34,000 between 2018 and 23. That's nearly a 70% increase. What's more, Auckland Council's own housing updates show attached homes have also made up the majority of new dwelling consents in recent years. In March 2026, just this year, 35% of new dwellings consented across Auckland were houses, 9% were apartments, and a whopping 56% were townhouses, flats, units, retirement village units or attached dwellings. That's 65% going into increased intensification. So despite all the theoretical and ideological enabled capacity, what's happening on the ground is huge intensification around Auckland, east, west, south, north and anywhere else. And all you have to do is hop in the car and drive around and just have a look at the apartments, the townhouses, the higher-rise buildings. It's already happening. That's a product of the existing unitary plan. So the kind of notion that just pick a number, 2 million, 1.6, 1.4, that's actually going to significantly impact what's already happening in the ground is a bit fanciful. I wouldn't mind so much, and I say this every time, if there was a real impact on affordability or home ownership. But no, it's not. The last decade hasn't done that at all. Home ownership has plummeted. So from a high of 75% in the mid-80s to barely 59% now. So we're on our way in Auckland, which is the most unaffordable city in New Zealand, to nearly just 1 in 2 people owning their own home. So this enabled capacity or intensification hasn't shifted that dial at all. In fact, it's gone backwards. And part of the reason it's gone backwards is because people haven't really taken into account the kind of historical background to the situation that has been around for well over a decade now, and that is really the disappearance of low-cost housing in New Zealand, but particularly in Auckland, where in previous decades nearly a third of our housing stock were in the lower quartile. So that was low-cost housing, but good quality housing. That was enabled by government policy. So we have this charade now of successive governments talking about zoning, as if zoning is in effect an affordability measure. It's not. It's almost an excuse for non-action, because back in those days when we did have plenty of accessible, affordable, low-cost housing, we had governmental policies that helped. People could capitalise on their family benefit. They could get a mortgage at just 3%, which was nearly half the rate banks were charging, and repayments were set in relation to people's ability to pay. So none of them are doing that. None of them are doing the things that actually produce good quality housing right around all the suburbs of Auckland. Instead, we have a default position of coming up with various rezoning and intensification plans that essentially don't shift the dial anyway, and in the case of the unitary plan, are apparent attempts to change things that are already working on the ground, and that those intensification figures and the different types of housing typology already speak to that. So, Mr. Chair, in that rather revealing background, I think there's little choice other than to support the amendment that's put up. It's what our submitters thus far have told us, Aucklanders have told us in their various submissions, and it's one that will even increase the theoretical, with emphasis on theoretical intensification numbers that can occur over and above what's already enabled by the unitary plan.
Kia ora, thank you, Councillor Henderson.
Thank you, Chair. Regrettably, I'm here once again to say that the culture of this council continues to be to try and do as little as possible when it comes to housing, when it comes to urban planning. I don't understand why we have these conversations all the time and we don't see enabling housing as an opportunity, as a chance for more economic activity, for diverse, beautiful neighbourhoods that more people can enjoy. However, we continually do, or try to do, the bare minimum to introduce council red tape, to introduce made-up rules that restrict growth in the places that are best capable of supporting them, and to lower aspirations for Auckland and for future Aucklanders. That's what we do here at this council, over and over. I want to remind my colleagues, and we heard this today through the questioning, the economic benefit of each scenario is as follows. Scenario A is 700 million. This is pretty good. But scenario B is 1.7 billion. Scenario C is 3.3 billion. And the economic benefit of scenario D to Auckland is $3.9 billion. I didn't know that our economic shape as a city was so good that we can leave all this potential economic benefit and this GDP on the table. This is not just theoretical. This is people's jobs. This is people's businesses. This is people's livelihoods. We could be improving if we did our job by improving our planning and bringing people's homes closer to where they work and study. House prices in Auckland are still rated as severely unaffordable. And we've heard today, scenario D is the best to lower house prices and make them more sustainable. We've heard today as well, from a climate perspective, scenario B is much better than scenario A for lowering climate emissions. We've heard at this table previously the broader health impacts of our air quality, the premature deaths that are caused in this city, or significantly contributed to by the air quality of Auckland. To adopt a sole situation of scenario A completely ignores all that advice, completely ignores it. Now, I do agree with the mover that Aucklanders are exhausted. I'm bloody exhausted because I've made the same speech about 50 times here. But I'm frustrated and I'm exhausted with a process that has had constant political interference, especially this year in the run-up to the elections. Our targets have been repeatedly watered down or dropped without any principles toward long-term planning. It is short-termism. It's looking for the next election. It's something that the city has done over generations, and I think it's a disgrace. City planning is about a long-term roadmap to make Auckland better over generations and to remove that kind of short-termism. That's the attitude we should be having. I would rather, just in line with my questions, have received a scenario, by the way, where it was PC 120 inside the 10 kilometre radius and AUP outside. That's what I voted for previously. Under attachment C of this report. That's what I was led to believe. That's also what my constituents believed too. The south and west of this city deserve more fairness in this planning process. Lastly, I've received plenty of correspondence from my constituents asking for fairer planning rules for the city, and I thank them for reaching out. Fairer rules that take into account the views of future Aucklanders, not just current ones. There was one I was reading that was begging me to vote for option D today, begging me, because they want their kids to stay in Auckland. And it's horrible that we're continually part of a process where we're allowing people to leave and they don't see a future in the city Young people, they don't want to set up because it's so unaffordable. I want to tell those people I tried my best to convince my colleagues at least. But in the meantime, it's appropriate at least to give an option alongside option A that is reasonable. That gives a choice for local boards and a voice for their communities in this process. I don't want to shut down that voice. So I urge my colleagues to vote down this amendment and stick to the recommendations. Thanks, Chair.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you very much. Councillor Gillen.
Thank you. Thank you to Councillor Newman and Councillor Winiata for putting this forward. I know that the Chair is trying to find a compromise solution by suggesting endorsing both scenarios A and B. But I do think we need to be very explicit with local boards and iwi on which direction we're heading in. My strong preference is that we make the regional decision here and choose one scenario so that the local board feedback we receive concentrates on ironing out any local anomalies and ensuring that local context is incorporated. If we confuse the matter by including multiple scenarios, we might not get those nuances. Instead, the feedback will be on why one option is preferred over the other. So that's one reason why I'm supporting the amendment, because it narrows it down to one scenario. The other reason I'm supporting the amendment is because of the difference between A and B for the North Shore. In many parts of Auckland, the differences between scenario A and B might not be too different. I'll let others speak to the awards, but for the North Shore, the on-the-ground differences between scenario A and B are significant. And most of that is due to the 10-kilometre circle that unfairly treats the North Shore as part of the CBD. For example, in Takapuna, the walkable catchment that stretches up Lake Road to Hauraki Corner will be 6 stories under scenario A, just like many other centres around Auckland. But under scenario B, thanks to the circle, much of it will be 15 stories. On the Kaipāriki side of the North Shore, under scenario A, the increase in intensification and heights is limited to the town centres where most people would expect it to be. But under scenario B, thanks again to the 10-kilometre circle, the orange terrace housing and apartment zone will be applied to the whole of Onewa Road, Makoia Road up to Veron's Corner, then all of Birkenhead Ave and Glenfield Road. And it will also take in many of the smaller side streets. Local residents may be aware of the many issues that residents of Zion Road and Birkenhead have had with inappropriate large developments. Well, under scenario B, that will be replicated on many other unsuitable roads, like Domain Road, Capilano Place, Corrigan Ave, Felstead Street, Bellevue Ave, the northern part of Chelsea View Drive, Greendale Spur, Kitawao Street and all of its side roads, and it goes on. And this is irrespective of current traffic issues, on-street car parking issues, infrastructure deficits, geography or the need. What is particularly unfair though is under scenario B, this treatment is not being applied to other equivalent suburbs, just the North Shore due to the 10-kilometre circle. And of course, all of this is completely unnecessary to meet the government's requirements. Like many around the table, I've received a range of feedback by email, comments, in person, and from local representative groups on the 4 scenarios with varying support for each of them. However, by a long way, the overwhelming feedback that I have received is in support of scenario A. And when I also take into consideration the original Plan Change 120 feedback, where 56% opposed what was in it, and most of the rest wanted changes. And then I also take into consideration the direction from the government, who of course have been driving this whole thing, when I consider that they intentionally reduced the capacity we need to meet from 2 million down to 1.6 million, and then again down to 1.4 million, due to the feedback that they received directly from Aucklanders. And when I take all of that into consideration, I also think about the upcoming RMA changes and how we're very likely to be dealing with even more radical changes to the unitary plan. Then, Mr. Chair, we should only be proposing the minimal changes that we need to meet our legal requirements, and that is scenario A. So please, instead of putting local boards and iwi through confusing and unnecessary job of considering multiple scenarios and zones for every property in their area, we should only be endorsing one scenario, and that should be scenario A. So, Mr. Chair, I support the amendment. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you. Councillor Fully.
Yeah, kia ora. Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Councillor Newman and Winiata for putting up an amendment. But to be honest, I would have struggled to support any recommendation put forward with just putting forward one option for iwi and for our local boards to respond to. And that's because I've received very mixed feedback from the local boards that I serve in the Manukau ward. For example, Otara Papatoetoe local board, they have said to me that they are concerned about the intensification around local centres like Dawson Road and for Mangere o Tauhu, Mangere East. And anyone who's been to Dawson Road will know why. Because that area, it's not appropriate to have any intensification around 6 stories and things like that. Just the public amenity isn't there, public transport options are few and far between, and it may look on paper like it's a good place to put intensification, but believe you me, for someone who lives there, it's not. On the other hand, though, both local boards do support increasing the capacity for us to build more, to open up for more homes because of the housing shortage that we are suffering under right now, and because of the projected growth. We are being told all the time that we are going to hit 2 million citizens in Auckland sooner rather than later, and we have to prepare for that growth. We have a housing crisis now. We've been in one for over a decade. So both local boards support somehow increasing, the capacity for building homes. And then more generally, there's widespread concern out there in my community here in South Auckland and in West Auckland about the perceived inequities of some of the plan changes, or some of the changes in the plan change for South and West Auckland, as Councillor Patterson-Hamlin so eloquently put. There is a perception out there that South Auckland and West Auckland will be carrying the weight of those changes and that intensification. So for all of those reasons, I'm sorry, Councillor Newman and Councillor Winiata, I would prefer for 2 options to go out to iwi and to local boards. I do think that they would be able to give us good advice or good, feedback to help us make an informed decision in July. I would have also preferred perhaps if even we could put option C before them, but I accept too that staff wouldn't be able to do that in time. And of course, local boards can still give us feedback on both options C and D and any other options that they may have in mind as well. So for those reasons, Chair and councillors, I won't be supporting this amendment. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Kia ora, Councillor, thank you. Mayor Brown.
Okay, I won't be supporting this. Not surprisingly, it's just illogical that we can say that railway stations on one side of Auckland are allowed to behave differently from ones on the other side of Auckland. And I've been spending, everyone talks about what their local inputs from their little area are, but I'm the mayor for the whole district, and I can tell you the most popular thing is that we fight back against Wellington telling us how to run our city. This is just caving into some Wellington wishes. I'm not happy about that. It's 6 months before an election. It seems to be party driven, and it's illogical. Newmark and Ellerslie deserve multi-storey buildings. That's where people are catching the railway from, and just like Mount Eden does as well. And not everybody in Mount Eden's mad about that, or Kingsland either. But we're going to do that because it makes sense. We just spend all this bloody money on this train set, which has caused enough trouble as it is, just even getting our rates up to in order to pay for that and maintain our credit rating without behaving badly. So I understand why people are putting this forward for various reasons, but it doesn't do it with me. And in fact, multi-storey living's pretty good. You should try it. You get great views, and it's good for everybody. I'm sure that the view across Pakuranga from a height Papakura is quite good. I can't really see it from a height out there, but there's some nice things to look at. Can't be all bad. So there you go. And you can even see Waiheke on a good day from where I am, and you can see the people out there, including our local representative, who can't see Auckland, but we can see him. So I'm definitely not going to vote for this. In fact, I would like to have A, B, C and D, but I can see that B makes sense as well because it will equalise the railway stations down both sides. And all the bus routes down through Balmoral and all that area there, which is where the growth is going to be. It's not going to be a big piddling little street over in Devonport. Okay, thanks.
Kia ora, Mayor, thank you very much. Councillor Short.
Thank you. I completely understand that this will be referred to local boards and iwi entities for feedback, but I'm at a loss as to why we would choose to be so conservative with the options before us. We have a genuine opportunity right now to create meaningful, positive change for our city. One that delivers more housing where it makes most sense, protect our ratepayers' massive investments in transport infrastructure, and builds more of a livable Auckland for the future. I want to back the bold decisions you, as councillors, have already made for the city. I want to back the billions of dollars that ratepayers have invested in our transport network, the city rail link, the frequent transit corridors, and the infrastructure that is ready and waiting to support our smarter growth. Voting for scenario A sends exactly the wrong message. It tells the public and future generations that we don't fully trust the strategic directions or decisions that we've made in this room. And we're not prepared to back the significant investments we've already asked ratepayers to fund. I have every faith that my two local boards, Upper Harbour, Hibiscus and Bays, and iwi entities have the ability to give us comprehensive feedback on the options in front of them. We can and should do better. Let's support, thank you, Newman. Let's support a scenario that properly integrates housing with transport, maximises value from our existing infrastructure, and shows real ambition for Auckland. Sorry, Newman, and sorry, Winiata, but I won't be supporting your amendment today.
Kia ora, Councillor Short. Thank you very much. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an interesting debate, and it's all about really intensification. On one hand, intensification is great. That's what we need. It's going to really help our community. And on the other hand, we don't like it, do we? It's to be imposed on others. That's the problem. That's the credibility gap here. However, that being said, the factor that is really missing from this debate is the people of Auckland, what they want. We do live in a democracy. We do have obligations under the Local Government Act, and we swear to uphold our obligations as the right to be sworn in as councillors. And under the Local Government Act, we have to consult on significant decisions, and we have to take seriously what the public's view is. And yet, we've had no real analysis of what the public wants. No real analysis from our management. Thanks to Councillor Turner, we have a reasonable idea what the public view is, and it's overwhelmingly against the plan which was rushed through before Christmas. Here's the problem. How can we make a sound decision if we have no real analysis of what the public wants? We've all had our feedback and it's pretty clear, but all the same, it's a curious and glaring omission from this bureaucratic process that we demanded the public submit before Christmas, rush it through, rush in your submissions in haste, and yet all those months later, still no real objective, no scientific analysis of what those 10,500 or so submissions actually asked. That's the problem with this process. In regard to the amendment, I support it. I think unsurprisingly, the officers wanted a B for obvious reasons, and that what we hear from the public is A, and the government, I guess, A is the best approach, especially given this plan change. only has a use-by date until the end of next year. And I heard it's going to be costing 20 million. It's just unsupportable. Can I also make some points here in regard to points raised by other members? The argument's been framed that we have a choice in terms of providing housing, and we already have provision for 900,000 under the existing unitary plan, and we build about 15,000 a year. There is a false dichotomy. It's either urban and compact, or it's greenfields. Well, actually, we have both. We have both. Who are we kidding here? Just in the Greater Whitford area alone, there's planned to be 15,000 dwellings out in the rural fringe, and that's going on all over the region. So let's put aside the false dichotomy. High rise said intensified as more climate friendly. Well, that goes against the latest research, which talks about the urban island effect, that high-rise intensified cities are much more warmer than low-rise cities. So if we're worried about emissions and the greenhouse gas emissions, and we know what a greenhouse is, well, a high-rise city actually generates more heat. So let's put that aside. The other one is the assumption that ramping up the theoretical supply of dwellings actually impacts on the prices. That's gobbledygook as well. The facts don't support that at all. We're talking about one side of economics, supply side, and ignoring the demand side. So the recommendation that the amendment plans to change is really having a bob each way, having A and B, and passing the buck. We are the governing body. We are the people elected to make these decisions on behalf of the people of Auckland, not really the local boards, not really mana whenua. It's up to us. The buck stops here. And A is the approach, is the option we should be supporting, because that is the option, I would say, supported by the overwhelming majority of our fellow Aucklanders. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you very much. Councillor Turner, I'm sorry we're still interrupting your birthday.
It's okay, and I just made it home. And I've been listening the whole way, and thank you to everybody who are putting all your effort and energy into this. I will be supporting this amendment. We didn't hear today that this was going to make a guaranteed economic return of X amount per scenario. We were told that was expected, could happen. The analysis had led to believe. We didn't hear that that climate change was going to be fixed by this. We were told that there was no analysis done of that. This is an academic discussion we're having here, and it is not the reality for Aucklanders on the ground. I wasn't going to say, Councillor Lee mentioned my report that I got done. It was overwhelming of what Aucklanders want, and it did show how car parking and all those other sorts of considerations is in their mind. I sat on that report for 48 hours because Councillor Fletcher wanted to send it to the government, and I understand it made the Prime Minister's desk. I don't know, maybe it was a coincidence. Less than 1 week later is when they dropped the figure from 1.6 to 1.4. The people are speaking. Yes, I got an email this morning too, from a person begging me to vote for the higher limits. One, I got two actually, but one was about 2 sentences and one was 1 sentence. I got a whole bunch of emails and some phone calls from people who just want to keep this as low as possible. And the last thing was, I understand the nonsense about naming 5 railway stations on the Western Line only. That wasn't us. That is the government who's done that. But that again, we also heard when we were talking today that this guarantee that they're going to be built by the railway lines is not there, because we're just talking about a capacity and the market forces will decide where it goes. And as I've said before, all the apartments built in West Auckland so far were joint ventures with the government. The market forces didn't force them there. So at the moment, I support this amendment because we need to have as minimal as we can to meet the government's statutory requirements they've forced upon us, their mandate, and then hopefully not too much change in the future, but we will be revisiting this. So I'll be supporting this amendment. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor, and happy birthday from all of us. People started singing, but lucky the mics were off for you. Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Chair. I won't be supporting the amendment, but I respect it and I understand it. I represent an area that is under significant intensification, and there are benefits and there are detriments, and there's just the effects on people is phenomenal and their business. But I'm wanting to hear from the local board and our iwi authority on both options before I make the decision on which one to go with. So that's what I'm looking at. We're not making the decision, we're just looking at what we go out and consult on. I'd rather hear on both, because that is the feedback I'm getting, is minimal intensification, or I'm getting mainly younger ones saying, please go with D. So I'll go with both options to hear from our local boards in iwi. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor, thank you. Member Wilson.
Thank you. Look, aroha mai, my laptop might be reflective of where I'm at. It's gone offline, so aroha mai. I had no intention to speak, but I keep looking at the amendment up there, and if I have that correct, and bearing in mind what Councillor Lee referred to in terms of decision making, I take that to mean that this committee is intending to vote on a scenario as the basis for our engagement with on this matter. And I think that's supporting that there's a consideration here that the recommendation is pretty clear. What is the basis for the engagement for local body and iwi? And yet the argument's been more about what everyone else would like to do in their respective areas. But when is it that the committee gets to decide what's the basis of engagement for ourselves and all local boards? I find that bizarre. My kōrero that I said at the beginning was, in order to have a comparison to form the basis of the engagement with, I can only speak in terms of iwi engagement, is that you can compare one with the other. John, I absolutely acknowledge that the hard yards your team has done in order to bring to a suitable standard sufficient for all to understand rather quickly, and in another 2 weeks you'll even have option C in the running. 2 comparisons for mana whenua or iwi engagement is a heck of a lot better than 1 when you've got sufficient information put together by John and his team. Nothing is perfect because everything is always done in a real hurry. So I'll definitely not be supportive of an amendment that is telling iwi engagers what the basis of our engagement will be about. It gives us no chance or no opportunity whatsoever to have a comparison of what's available and the information available. We are not in support of this amendment. Thank you.
Kia ora, Member Wilson. Were there any other speakers? Councillor Fletcher. Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. It's been a long day, and I want to start off by commending the movers of the amendment. I want to thank Daniel Newman and Matt Winiata for putting this forward, because the reality is, over the last 6 years, we have seen successive governments make an absolute balls up on this. They were well-intentioned. They wanted to be seen to be doing something about a housing crisis, but they never really put the issue of affordability and housing real demand together. And they failed to understand that we actually had supply under the Auckland Unitary Plan. There were about 900,000 from memory in terms of enablement. We saw the pushback from the public. I think I outlined in my questions just the absolute frustration that I have with government, that it just kept snowballing. And I suspect it's going to keep snowballing. We're going to have Groundhog Day here in 18 months' time when we have to revisit this whole thing again. And it leaves me with a real sense of distaste for government. And I say that plurally. I don't mean one government or the other. They just never really understood Auckland. And on that point, I share the Mayor's view. This should never have been dictated from Wellington, because they just didn't understand the nuances. They didn't understand the real estate market. They didn't. And anyway, the upshot is we are where we are. We've now got the government dropping back to 1.4. We have an option before us. We know that without overreach, they'll be able to work within that, knowing that it's all going to come back into this chamber again very, very shortly. And you heard that this is probably going to be the easiest to implement. It's not going to stop with this option. We will look forward to the feedback from the local boards. We will look forward to the feedback from mana whenua. I think it's really important that we get that. But I feel that the public are going to feel betrayed because they really haven't been heard. So in the midst of this mess, and I can only view it as a mess, I think that this is the only sensible outcome, and there does need to be clarity around for the local boards to be able to submit to us, and for mana whenua too, if I dare say that. I think to start again on all of the different options would be overwhelming. But the public have got a right to know. For most families, their home is really important to them. And they've made huge sacrifices to get submissions in. They've made, many of them engaged lawyers. They took on board all sorts in the good faith that the plan as it was proposed was going to continue. And of course, what we've seen is some capitulation on that, which from my perspective, I welcome. But I think that this is the only reasonable outcome. And I hope that as we progress this, I'd like to think in Auckland, we have a beautiful city. We've got interesting history and the character villas and these sorts of things reflected in part. We've got other parts, we've got manga, it is fantastic. And if we could just stop beating up on each other and government beating up on us, we could probably have our cake and eat it too. We can accommodate the growth that is coming our way. And we don't need to destroy the history of our city in the process. I am quite accepting of the fact that we have made massive investments in infrastructure, and we do have to optimise those investments. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, let's try and do this sensibly. And right now, at this very moment in time, we don't have a housing crisis. Go and talk to any real estate agent in Auckland right now and find out whether there are properties, you know, a glut of properties that are available. This is not like you have the sense of urgency that you have to act right this minute for something that's going to last you for 30 years. This is only going to last you for a year at best. So I think the amendment put forward by Councillor Newman and Councillor Winiata is the right way to go, and I will be supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Last speaker, Councillor Ferry, on the amendment.
Kia ora. All right. I've got a bunch of small points and then I got some big points. So I'm going to try and run through the small points fast. The housing affordability stats. A long time ago, it feels like Councillor Patterson-Hamlin shared them, but we've had a couple of people more recently say that the unitary plan hasn't moved the dial on housing affordability, but in actual fact it has. So it used to be worse. So in 2023, we had a median of 10.8. 2024, 8.2, 2025, 7.7. 2026 now it is 6.9. Still severely unaffordable, but less severely unaffordable than it was and heading in the right direction. And there's a whole lot of academic research that shows that that is a result of the upzoning that happened through the Auckland Unitary Plan. I don't think it went far enough. None of you will be surprised to hear that. But actually we know that zoning, while being only one of the tools in the toolbox, you know, the claims that it doesn't make a difference, it does. It doesn't make enough of a difference, but it does make a difference. We also had some stuff around heat islands and the fact that more intense areas have more heat and therefore are bad for climate. Actually, our biggest contribution to the climate issues is transport emissions. And we know that, and we've talked about that frequently in committee. And having people live closer to the centre, closer to what they wish to access, reduces their transport needs to travel significantly and reduces emissions. We also know that it's relatively easy to deal with those heat island aspects by making sure we have sufficient open space, putting in street trees, using roof gardens, vertical green walls, all sorts of stuff like that. So let's put that claim to one side. We also had stuff about that we weren't given data on the submissions by officers for this debate today. It's attachment B, folks. It's right there. And actually what the submissions analysis needs is a more nuanced eye than AI can provide. And what their breakdown showed us is that far from the large bulk of the submissions being on people necessarily wanting down zoning. We don't know that yet. Actually, the biggest area of concern was natural hazard risk, which has been one of my motivating factors in this debate right from the start. And it's the reason why I was really clear before the election where I stood on this stuff, that I support a compact city model, that I support moves that will bring down the cost of housing. And also, while we're saying, I was astonished to hear that we just had a claim that we don't have a housing crisis, when the start of today, we were talking about homelessness, which is at record levels. And the OECD data is very clear that actually we have a major issue with housing affordability for the people on the lowest incomes. New Zealand is one of the worst performing OECD nations for the percentage of their income that our poorest people have to spend on housing. Routinely over 40 to 50% of our low income people are having to pay what's called an overburdened amount on their housing costs internationally. So we absolutely have a housing crisis. We've had one for generations, unfortunately, and I do not want to bequeath one to the next. To that end, I cannot support this amendment. This amendment locks us into the old patterns. I prefer that we were doing actually something between C and D. That's not on the table, and I get that. But we can at least put B up for feedback. I think that it would be irresponsible, frankly, to only put something that is a small move, which brings me to my last final big point, which is we are not here to do the bare minimum, folks. None of us surely stood for that. Surely we all stand for a bigger vision for our city and for our residents than doing the bare legal minimum. And if not on housing or not on the shape of our city, if that is not something where we have ambition and vision beyond the bare legal minimum, then what are we doing here? What is our purpose? Our purpose is surely, with all our disagreements about what it looks like, to create a better city, to make sure that everyone has decent housing, to make sure that people aren't getting flooded on a regular basis. And I will not support the limited vision of only putting out scenario A. So I'll be voting against this amendment. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Councillor. Sorry, I thought I was at the end, but now Councillor Williamson, would you like to speak as well, or were you talking about when it comes to the vote?
No, I would like to speak. Sorry, I've managed to move my doctor's appointment to 7:30. Get my stitches out. Can I just say that I'm a big fan of intensifying along rail corridors because it's pointless building a $6 billion train set and not putting customers available to it. However, I worry about the number of people who today have said that, we've got this shortage of availability of land. And I did a couple of things that I thought were useful. I went and spoke with both John Duguid and with Megan Tyler and said, under the Auckland Unitary Plan of 2016, didn't it make 30,000 dwellings available times 30 years to give you 900,000? And John Duguid corrected me and Megan. They both said, well, actually, it made it all available in one big swoop, the 900,000. And I went, oh, okay. I'd been labouring under the thought that we were only going to be releasing 30,000 a year for 30 years to give us the 900. And then I went to Gary Blick and I said, can I get a copy of the number of residential housing building consents and the number of building consents that were completed in each of the years since the unitary plan was implemented 10 years ago? And I've got the figures in front of me. I won't bore you by reading them all, but I'll tell you the average. On average, each year for the last 10 years, there have been 15,200 applications for building consents. And on average over the last 10 years, there's been 12,400 actually completions. So if we were making 30,000 available a year, in fact, it was more because the whole 900,000 was available right from the word go. And we were only ever getting 15,000 applications, some of which obviously didn't go through, and only 12,000 completions per annum each year for 10 years. I sort of don't know why we're even revisiting this at all, other than to try and get some intensification around transport corridors and around sort of CBDs and around town centres. And so I'm happy to support the amendment, because I think it goes as far as is needed. In fact, I actually think the government's wrong that, because there isn't one of you there today that can say to me, oh, well, there's been a shortage of land available and that's what's driven house prices. I've got a graph that shows what happened to house prices when Adrian Orr at the Reserve Bank dropped the official cash rate to 0.25%. In other words, money was free. And house prices went through the roof because he also tipped megalitres of liquidity into the finance markets. People could borrow anything they wanted, and they could borrow at a rate that was actually free. And it corresponds, if you look at the graph, to where Auckland house prices went through the roof. It also corresponds to where, if you look at the graph of net migration, went to a mountainous peak around that 2021, 22, and then into the beginning of 23. So we had a flood of people pouring in across the border in terms of net, not talking about gross, but net flooding across the border. We had an unbelievably cheap money, free money, really. Anyone that wanted it could just borrow it and do what they liked, and most people could. And we already had huge amount of availability of land for building. So there is not one person can say, well, the only reason we've got all these house prices right now is there wasn't any land to build them on. We weren't even coming close to using the capacity that had been made available. We weren't even coming close to it. And had we been, I'd have said, well, there's the problem. We've got just such a shortage of land availability. We've got to make more available. So my view is this is good. It actually will allow us to do some stuff around the rail corridors. I think the mayor's right. I don't know why we'd only do it well around the rail corridor in one direction and not the other, which I guess is what your plan B is talking about. But for goodness sake, let's get something really sharp and focused for the public to look at. And I promise you, based on the track record of both this government and where it's gone, that we'll be back again. And we'll not only be back again over this stuff, but we'll probably be back again when the RMA reforms are done and so on. It is just literally a bugger's muddle in my view, and I'm happy to support the amendment. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you very much. Right, we'll move now to the vote. I'm assuming... Division, yeah. I wasn't going to guess, but I assumed so. So if you have your computer ready, vote that way, and Sandra will work it out by voices for those who don't or aren't able to use the computer. Cool, thank you. Now this is about voting for or against the amendment.
Thank you, members. As the Chair said, we will be voting for the amendment by division. If you are ready to vote, we will start the vote now via resolve.
Mr. Chair, I'm for, please. And I apologise, I did ask the Secretariat just that I could do mine by voice, but I have now been able to get back onto the computer and use Resolve.
Thank you, members. So the result of the amendment is a tie, 11 votes to 11. So that gives the Chair a casting vote.
Does that include Ken Turner's? Because it's not shown.
Yes.
Yes.
We need them to cast these vote.
All right. Well, I will vote in favour of the resolution that gives local boards and mana whenua entities a say on both options. So, however on can... Oh, right. No, sorry. So against choosing only one. No, sorry about that. Yeah, against.
So thank you, members. That amendment is lost. And the casting vote was against the amendment. Lost.
Right. So now I'm putting forward, I'm assuming there's no debate, but maybe there is. Okay. Thank you, Councillor.
Yeah, well, actually, you can just take another minute or two with me. Chair, I just want to make the point. I know that debate has now gone on the amendment, but you were gracious enough to include, well, some people say you're gracious, other people might say a different word, but you effectively have incorporated two scenarios. That's your recommendation. I would make the point to colleagues, and I guess maybe for Member Wilson, that the first time that we're actually getting two scenarios here for consideration is right now. That the officer's report includes a recommendation for consideration based on one scenario only. Two scenarios here. Chair, I hope that you will implore the officers to ensure that they are working in real time to make tweaks as they get the feedback from the local boards, because that's and from iwi authorities who are going to be incorporating, who you're about to incorporate into the consultation and engagement. Because I think that even if the officers would prefer B, I really think that you will find that the preference will be for something other than scenario B. It will have to be something of a compromise, Chair and Ms. Tyler. The second thing that I would say is that regardless of whether you think that this is ambitious enough or not, any of the scenarios in the report represent significant change for the region. It is not a situation of the lowest pass mark, as was referred to today, in relation to a scenario. These are significant, manifestly complex issues which will reshape significant parts of the region, and that is something for which the community is very, very askance about, because the impact here is on our transmission infrastructure. And the final thing that I would say, Chair, is that I do hope that in the report back that the officers, the cost of doing all this work is quantified in the officers' report, because it is important for central government to tally up actually what this is costing this council at a time when we are being asked to consider the rate cap. This is a scenario which, well, this whole exercise is running into the millions. Aucklanders need to know how many million. And the Minister needs to account for how many million, because it is a compliance cost that the Minister is directing on us, because we already had an operative Auckland Unitary Plan. This should have been settled. It's the government that's forcing this whole debate, but the government isn't writing the cheque for it. It's being underwritten by the ratepayers of Auckland. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And you probably think I was extra nice because technically your speaking turn was your amendment, and I let you speak again, which I didn't realise I wasn't supposed to, but I'm okay with that. Ngārimu has Member Blair has a point of order, sorry.
Yeah, point of order. Chair, I think my vote was recorded incorrectly, so I was logged out for some reason, probably the length of the meeting. But I did say I vote against these fellas, which was, yeah.
Yeah. So can I just have it clear from...
Four.
I know. But can we have it just clarify what that means, that I didn't need to use my casting? Can I have...
No, Edwin. Against the men.
Yeah, but it's quite an important detail that... I know. There's a note going in the minute. Well, I don't know. It does seem... Yeah, I know, but it was actually... The vote was 10-12, not 11-11, so I wouldn't have had to use my casting vote. I think it's an important distinction. That's fine.
I think we should go back to the verbal voting when it comes to the division, actually.
Yeah. Thank you. Right. Speaking to this, Councillor Filipina, hasn't spoken all day.
Tēnā koe he mana, and tēnā koe te katoa. Look, I didn't speak at the amendment because as it's now shown, it's 10, 12. But Chair, the reason I'm speaking here is to acknowledge the work that you've done to get us to this position. In the previous item, I heard a few of the councillors in particular mention it's good to go out to our community, get their voices. I also heard a few people also mention that, look, we should just have one option. It's easier for our local boards and iwi or mana whenua to do that because it's just so hard. That, from my perspective, is a load of rubbish. We should be going out. And I'm glad that this option is now the substantive, because we should never, ever underestimate the local boards and their knowledge nor should we underestimate mana whenua and iwi around their knowledge in regards to things, in particular the Plan Change 120. So, Chair, I acknowledge you for the work that you've done to get us to this compromise. It is better for us to get it out to our community, both options, and let them come to us to tell us, here is what we think about those options. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you. I have no other speakers, so I think we'll just move to the vote. All those in favour? Any opposed? Thank you very much, everyone. Now we'll move, we'll actually just...
Chair, I tried to abstain on that vote because I would have preferred, obviously,
Councillor
the amendment.
Fletcher would like to abstain. Thank you very much for that, I think, really good conversation from everyone. I think we should just have a 5-minute break, especially for our staff, and then we will go to the next lot of plan changes. Thank you.